before the pandemic, it seemed that this phase one trade agreement could act as a stabilizer for the broader disagreements between the two countries. But given this increasing confrontation, where do trade relations go and where do this agreement go from here?
I think trade relations will remain fraught, highly contentious, and subject to deep disagreements between the two sides. But as for the phase one agreement, I think that China would like to implement it. I think the U.S. would still like to see China move forward with it. I don't think either side has much appetite right now for further confrontation, given the state of the global economy and given the state of both of their economies, particularly unemployment. So I suspect China will struggle to try and meet targets on purchases. I think they'll fail in doing that, but I think the United States, for at least the present time, will let that ride.
Charlene, I want to bring up some comments you made in November at our Bloomberg New Economy Forum. You said that the Chinese model today fuses the party, resurgent state planning, massive subsidies, protectionism, and IP theft, all turbocharged by scale. So over the long term, how do you see the West reconciling differences in worldview in addition to the attraction of the Chinese market?
I think the Chinese model and U.S. and Western models are antithetical to each other, by and large. That doesn't mean the two halves, if you will, can't find ways to get along. It doesn't mean they can't cooperate. It doesn't mean they're destined for conflict. But I think it's important to recognize these systems and the values and views behind these systems are very, very different. For the West, a consolidation of democracy, as well as becoming much more attuned to international need will be important. For China, a recognition that it will have to live in harmony with Western democracies will become critical.
Charlene, based in Hong Kong, have you known relations, or should I say Sino-American relations, to be as bad as this in modern times? And how much do you think this is posturing ahead of November's elections, and how much of it is actually real?
The rhetoric, which is becoming increasingly vitriolic, has a large element of posturing and political theater in it, particularly on the U.S. side, but also on the China side. On the other hand, I do think that there are three characteristics or outgrowths of the current situation between the two countries. One is substantial distrust and concern among our populations about the other country. In a recent poll, 2/3 of Americans now believe China is a threat. That's 20 points higher than it was when Donald Trump took office. I think second, you see a widening of the fissures between the two countries. Started out as a tariff war, moving to a technology war, moving now to an investment war, and to some extent financial flows. And I think most pointedly, you see further evidence on the part of both parties, frankly, to decouple the economies. China, with respect to a technology decoupling using alternative standards and so on, and the U.S. Focused most immediately on the issue of supply chains. I think these trends are highly unfortunate. I think they are destabilizing, but I do think they reflect an attitude beyond the posturing or beyond some of the heated rhetoric, but something deeper and more concerning, which is the two nations now look at each other not just as competitors, but as something somewhat more pernicious.
And Charlene, with that in mind, are we heading towards a bipolar world once again? And a trade war, which I've always maintained has got technology characteristics, as you've alluded to. It would be a different type of bipolar system, though, would it not? Not like the Cold War, where you had, it was an ideological battle, if you will. In this case, both of them would be capitalistic.
Well, I think it's early to say the world is going to become bipolar. One could argue it is becoming increasingly apolar. And the reason I say that is the United States, at least under the current U.S. administration, has walked away from its traditional leadership role in the global economy, including with respect to crisis response globally. So the U.S. has walked away. China has filled the portions of the vacuum left by the U.S. that it views as desirable to fill, but is not in a position, and actually I believe has no desire to become necessarily the hegemonic power or to ascribe that role to itself in all of its many manifestations. And so if the U.S. refuses to lead and China doesn't fully fill the vacuum or fills it only selectively, and Europe is turned inward and I believe is really not rising to the occasion of its very critical role globally, then we're looking at a world that's rather more messy than anything that's either unipolar or bipolar, but rather something that is a little more amorphous and perhaps a little less stable.